Want to say hello to everyone today, wherever you're watching from, and welcome Fiona Davis to our group. So Fiona is the New York best-selling author of her historical novels set in iconic New York City buildings, including The Lions of Fifth Avenue, which was a Good Morning America book club pick. She began her career in New York City as an actress, working on Broadway, off-Broadway, and in regional theatre. After getting a master's degree in Columbia Journalism School, she fell in love with writing, leapfrogging from editor to freelance journalist before finally settling down to write fiction. Her books have been translated into over a dozen languages, and she's based in New York City. So thanks, Fiona, so much for joining us. And just wanted to let everyone know I've recently been reading The Masterpiece, which I hadn't read any of your books before, so this is the first one and found it really, really interesting. This one's about Grand Central Station and what it talks about, something I'd never heard about, and it was very interesting. And your latest novel is The Lions Fifth Avenue. Would you like to maybe let us know a little bit more about that and anything else you want to share about yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Jackie, and thanks to everybody out there. This is just terrific. So I write books that are set in landmark New York City buildings like Grand Central, the Dakota, which is very famous for where John Lennon was shot, the Barbizon Hotel for women, the Chelsea Hotel. So there's so many wonderful buildings in New York. And what I do is I find a building and I do a ton of research about the history of the building and who lived there and what it was like over all the different eras. So like the Dakota, what was it like when it was first built in 1880? And then I have two timelines and, compare it to a more modern timeline. So you can see how the city and the characters have changed over time. And so, my latest book, The Lions of Fifth Avenue, is in fact set at the New York Public Library. And I got the idea for that from my readers, to be honest. I was doing a lot of author talks around the country, and people would come up to me after or during the Q&A and say, hey, you should set one at the New York Public Library. And I thought, it's a beautiful building, but, how much can happen in a library? I wasn't quite sure if I could make it work. And so I started doing research, and what I'm looking for are the surprises. Because I know if something surprises me, it will surprise the reader. And that's kind of the way into the story and the character and the plot. And for this one, I was looking at a New York Times article from 1951 that talked about the retirement of the superintendent of the library. And he had worked there for 30 years, starting when it opened in 1911. And the superintendent was a big job. He oversaw 90 people under him. It was a huge job keeping this huge building running. And because of that, he lived in an apartment in the library. And it was built in the library when it was first built in 1911. And it was this 7-room apartment. And he lived there with his wife and his 3 children. And the article talked about how his daughter was born in the library, about how his son used to raise pigeons on the roof, and that they used to play baseball in the reading room using books as bases until they got caught. It was just so full of these amazing stories. And I just started thinking, this is fantastic. Like a family living in the library, I can absolutely work with that. And then the second inspiration for the book comes from learning about a book theft that happened at Columbia University's Butler Library in 1994. And there, a thief stole $1.8 million of rare books and manuscripts over the course of 3 months. Wow. And no one could figure out how he was getting in and out. And I interviewed the head librarian at the time, who talked about how the staff were turning on each other. It was, this huge mystery. They finally caught him. And the librarian went before the judge and made this passionate plea to give the guy a harsher sentence because, it was like, oh, he stole books, whatever. And the judge listened to her. And, because of that, she's a true literary hero. And so I kind of molded those two real-life stories into one book. And so Lions is set in 2 timelines in 1913 and 1993. And it's from the point of view of two women. One is the wife of the superintendent, who's kind of surrounded by all these books and knowledge, but she wants something more out of life. So she applies to Columbia Journalism School, and her world is really blown wide open. And then in 1993, it's from the point of view of this curator of rare books who's putting on this big exhibit, and they start going missing. And she has to track down the thief and figure out how it relates to book thefts that happened 80 years earlier, as well as the terrible tragedy that happened to the superintendent's family back then. And so what I do is just kind of meld fact and fiction and try and explain very clearly in the author's note what is true and what is not. And I like stories that are page turners, with plot twists. And so you kind of are reading and you go, oh, wait a minute. And that's the kind of story I do, which is so much fun. It's a lot of fun.
And I like the different timelines as well. I really love reading books with different timelines.
Yeah, it's a wonderful way to kind of compare how things have changed and how they haven't. So in my book in the 1910s, I learned about this club in Greenwich Village called the Heterodoxy Club. And it was this place where women would meet every Saturday and debate the issues of the day, like birth control or the right to vote or even free love, which is something we consider kind of 1960s-ish. But in the 1910s, these women were having it out. And so it's like really refreshing to see what was going on back then and to remind ourselves that history is kind of cyclical, and we tend to go in cycles where there's this great movement forward and then maybe a step back.
And were you able to meet anyone from the family who lived in the apartment?
I did not. I don't know if they're still around because it was some time ago. I know the mother died before they moved out. She was in a car accident. And so, and in a way, I kind of didn't want to know too much about the real family. Because it's important for me to kind of create a fictional character because then I can make them do what I want them to. I'd met someone though who had grown up in a library, not that one, but most of the libraries in New York, the old ones, had apartments in them because you needed someone on site to keep the boiler running. And so there's a wonderful woman named Sharon Washington, who's now an actress, and she wrote a one-woman show about growing up in a library. So she was very helpful to talk to about that.
So when you have an idea, do you start off with like thinking of a building you want to write about? Is that where you start off and then just investigate until you find something?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, my first book came out, it was set at the Barbizon Hotel for Women. It's called The Dollhouse. And at that point I was a journalist and I learned about this unusual setup where there were a dozen of the old-time residents of this kind of fancy all-women hotel that in the 50s Grace Kelly and Joan Crawford and Joan Didion stayed at. But then it went co-ed and then it became condos in the 2000s. And so I was curious what it was like because they made these luxury condos and put all these women on the fourth floor into these studio apartments with kitchenettes because they were all rent controlled. So they were paying like $200 a month while a guy, bought the $17 million penthouse. And I was curious how those two classes of residents, hit it off or did not. And I wanted to write an article about it. But the women at that time were very private and I couldn't get interviews. And I just started thinking, well, this could be a great story. And so I started interviewing women who'd stayed there and doing research into the time period and came up with the first idea for my book. So it kind of comes from the building each time. And then I've never had a time where I've looked at a building and discarded it because there's so many cool buildings in New York with layers of history to play with.
That's great. We've got quite a few people watching now. Just reminding people if they've got any questions for Fiona, please type them. And we've got some people saying where they're from. We've got Stacey from Kansas City, Gail from Florida, and Divine from New Jersey. One thing I'm wondering is, what's the most surprising thing you've found that's like maybe blowing your mind that you never would have thought that would have ever happened? Or
yeah, it's such a good question. I'm just running through my books. It's the one that you're reading now about where I set it at Grand Central Terminal. And as I did the research, I learned that there was this art school there called the Grand Central School of Art that was co-founded by John Singer Sargent in the 1920s. that it was there for 20 years, that it had something like 900 students a year, and no one had heard of it.
Yeah, I found that pretty amazing when I was reading.
Yeah, and so you just imagine all these artists running around, Grand Central and what was going on then. And to me, that was such a shock that I thought, ooh, I have to do that, even though I don't know a whole lot about art. I'd taken an art history class, pass-fail in college, and I passed, so I figure, I could write about art. and so that was just interviewing a lot of illustrators and artists and finding out, what it might have been like at that school in the 1920s and setting one of the time periods there. And that was so much fun to play with.
Yeah. And Divine said that she thinks that it was a really moving story that won the masterpiece.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a fun one because the timelines are 1920s and the 1970s. And the 20s are fun because it's the jazz age and there's, so much going on. And the 70s were such a contrast because New York City at that time was almost bankrupt. And Grand Central Terminal was just falling to pieces. It was, dangerous if you needed to catch a train, you got in and out as fast as you could. And, they were about to basically demolish it and put a 55-story business, a skyscraper on top of it. And people like Jackie O stepped in to save the day and really turn things around. And now when you walk into Grand Central, it's been fully restored. And it's almost like it was in the 20s again, where you walk in and it's this grand gleaming concourse. And again, that's what's fun, is to figure out how the city has gone through these changes and how to reflect that in the story.
Yeah. I'm interested to know, have you always wanted to be a writer?
No, I never imagined. I thought other people did that. No way. Like a 90,000 word book, that seemed impossible. And so when I came to New York, I first came as an actress, and I worked on Broadway and off Broadway and had a great time working with a theater company, and it was fantastic. And then as I hit my 30s, I applied to Columbia Journalism School and started doing that. And that started me freelance writing about health and fitness and the arts. And then eventually I just found this story about the Barbizon Hotel that I wanted to write. And I wanted to do a dual timeline because that's what I like to read. And so I started reading them and studying them, like tearing apart what happens when and how are they structured from a very technical point of view to figure out how to do it. My dad's an engineer. Okay. And I think that's, what I drew on is to, okay, if I'm going to write a book, let's go page by page, and so it was kind of a lark to see if I could pull it off. And that book, for some reason, just did really well and kind of hit the zeitgeist. And then suddenly I was off on this whole different career. I did not expect it. And so I always highly suggest that people change careers every 10 years because you never know where you might end up.
Yeah, that's pretty good advice.
And I also think that, I couldn't have written these stories when I was in my 20s because I didn't have anything to say. And now I'm in my early 50s. It's like, I have something, I've lived life. And so I feel like there's something to actually put on the page.
And did you have someone who really encouraged you to be a writer?
Not necessarily. I actually kept it secret. Okay. I didn't tell anyone because it was just almost like embarrassing of, oh yes, I'm going to write a book, And so I took some online writing classes and, did a lot of reading. But yeah, I kept it kind of quiet until it got closer and started looking like it would be published.
Yeah. And how hard or easy was it to have that first book published?
It was, I was really lucky in that I'd started going to panels and like conferences to learn more about the industry and how it works. Again, taking a very technical point of view from it. And I heard an agent speak in a panel about how she's looking for strong female characters. So when the manuscript was ready, I sent it to her and kind of said, hey, here's some strong female characters. I heard you speak. And I think that was just enough to get me out of the slush pile, that I made the effort and we'd been in a room together. And she liked it, and we did a lot of work on it. I didn't know what I didn't know. And we did a lot of editing. And that book got picked up. So that was kind of an amazing process that doesn't usually happen. And I'm very grateful how easy that was.
That's lucky for you. Stacey's wondering which book took you the longest to research.
Oh, yeah. Let's see. You know, it was really tricky. It was the book set at the Dakota. It's called The Address. And that was tough because I was dying to do that building because it's such a historical building. It's this beautiful building on Central Park West, and it was put there in the 1880s. And it's this luxurious, huge, almost like a castle. And when it was built, there was nothing else around it. It was goats and shanties and rocks. And then they put this, amazing building in the middle of the Upper West Side, which was kind of, no one would live there. And so I knew the history of the building, but I didn't know anyone who lived there. And that was a problem because I needed to get inside if I wanted to get a sense of the space. And of course, there's a lot of security. You can't just walk in. And so a friend of mine who's a real estate agent mentioned that Lauren Bacall's apartment in the Dakota was on the market for $23 million. And we should go. And so we got an appointment, and I threw a scarf around my neck and, got my most expensive purse. And we showed up and got this grand tour of Lauren Bacall's apartment, which she died a few years earlier, so it was an estate sale. But everything was intact, like the mantles, the wallpaper. It was just beautiful. And later I did get in to see a couple. I got a really lovely tour of the whole building from someone who lived there, and I got to know more people in the building, and that helped. But that was just tricky to even get in. It's not like Grand Central where you can wander in and, stare all you like.
You needed to know the right people.
Yes.
Patricia's wondering, do you have a strict writing regime?
Yeah, if I'm doing a first draft, which to me is the hardest part of writing a book, I will tend to write in the morning because I know I'll get it out of the way, and it's something I'm kind of dreading all day. And if I put it off, I'll just be consumed with guilt. So I'm just more energetic in the morning. So if I'm doing a first draft, I'll do that early in the morning, as early as I can. But then as I'm editing, can be more free flowing, and I really love editing. I love taking a first draft and kind of shaping it into what you want it to be, and seeing the possibilities of this skeleton, basically. And so that I can do pretty much any time. And I work from home, so, it's just a matter of sitting down and doing it, and not trying to avoid it by doing laundry or eating a lot of cheese.
And I love Gail's comments. So Gail has said that she has read almost every book you've written, and she used to work in New York City in the early 1970s, and she can really relate to all your books about the buildings in the city.
Oh, I love that she was there then, because that was such an interesting time. So she's seen the city change, and it was so different back then. It was so completely different. Yeah, I think New Yorkers, people who've lived in New York, when you leave it, you really miss it. And it kind of leaves a hole in your heart. And so I think the books have been helpful for people, especially I've gotten a number of emails this year about how they couldn't come to visit New York. So the books helped to kind of make them less homesick.
Yeah, and I personally have never been to New York, but just reading about Grand Central Station really made me feel like I was there and really want to come and visit one day. So hopefully I will be able to.
Yes, definitely. That's a long trip. I haven't been to Australia, but boy, I'd love to go.
Yeah, you'll have
to amazing.
Sometime. Yeah. Divine is wondering if you can tell us anything about the next book you're writing.
Oh, yeah, sure. So the book, and this will be coming out next January, it's called the Magnolia Palace. And there's a lesser-known museum in New York on Fifth Avenue called the Frick Collection. And it's this beautiful mansion on Fifth Avenue. And it was built by Henry Clay Frick, who was a steel magnate. And he lived there with his wife and his adult daughter. He died in 1919. And then after his wife died, the building was left to the city. And so it was a personal residence during kind of the Gilded Age, and then later a museum. And what's wonderful about it is the Fricks collected art. And so there's Renoirs and Turners and Vermeers. It's just full of art. And when you walk in today, it's like you're stepping back in time because everything's perfectly preserved. It's the same furniture, the same, candelabras. It's all really, really beautifully preserved. And so that's where I've set it. And it's set in 1919 and then 1966. Again, two completely different New York cities, almost like two completely different cities. And the building, you know, has different uses each time. And yeah, that's been really fun to write, and I'm excited to get that out.
Yeah, sounds good. And I'm just wondering, when you were at school, did you really enjoy history or in English, and what sort of subjects did you like at school?
Yeah, you know, I went to the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and I got a minor in English and a major in international relations. It was kind of an interdisciplinary one where you could take whatever classes you wanted, and I thought that would be fun. But yeah, you know, I really think that what all this came from was my parents are both English. And when I was a kid, we would go back every 3 years to visit all the relatives, and we'd travel all over England. And we'd stop at, you know, if there was a castle or a ruin or some kind of grand estate, so that we could run around and my brother and I could stop, you know, tearing each other's hair out in the back seat. And I just was so stunned at how old everything was, right? Where anything that's less than 400 years old there is considered pretty recent. And so I just, I think that's where my love of old buildings and the ghosts that walk the halls and wondering what happened back then came from. And so really that's where the book sprung out of, is just wanting to see all these layers of history in one building,
but she's been
and be able to compare and
she's
contrast.
actually going away tonight.
I think that's what drives me.
Yeah. And Asa is saying, do you think you'll ever write about a building outside of New York? And if you were, where do you think it might be?
I would love to set one in maybe London, you know, because there's some great buildings there.
And the history there, would be amazing.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great? So something like that would be really fun. And then I could travel there and, you know, take a tax deduction for, you know.
And Gail said that the Frick Museum is one of her very favourite museums, so she's really looking forward to your book.
Oh, I'm so glad. You know, not as many people know it. It's not like Grand Central or the Dakota. But the people who know it love it. Like, there's a rabid devotion to the Frick. And I'm excited to get more people to know about it and get familiar with that building, because it's a real beauty.
And I'm just wondering, do you on any of your social media share photos of, like, more photos and that of the buildings?
Yeah. If you go on to, especially Facebook, I have a ton of you know, each book has its, I share a lot of research there. Also, if you go to my website, which is FionaDavisBooks.com, for every book, there's an author Q&A kind of behind the scenes as to each book and different photos. For the Lions of Fifth Avenue, I just sent out a newsletter to all my subscribers that included a 25-minute video inside the library where you get kind of the grand tour of the building, which
I'll have to certainly look at that.
Yeah. And I try and, because I think people want to know, like, what's real and what's not. I get asked a lot, you know, the apartment in the New York Public Library, is that still there? And I was able to get a behind the scenes tour, and it's not, it's offices and storage, but you can still see exactly where it was and get a sense of what it was. I joke around that they should rent it out as an Airbnb, because people would pay so much money to sleep over in the library.
Stacey's wondering what drives you to pick the second timeline.
Yeah, you know, when I'm doing that, I'm usually looking for a timeline I haven't written about. Just to you know, try something fresh. Or I'm looking at something that it can really contrast with the earlier timeline. So in the Dakota book, the address, it's 1880s, which is right when the Dakota first opened, from the point of view of the housekeeper who's hired to run it. And then it's 1980, the other timeline, so 100 years later. And that's from the point of view of an interior decorator who's hired to strip one of the apartments of all its original detail and put up, you know, very 80s shag carpet, floor-to-ceiling mirrors, and basically completely ruin the apartment. And so you can kind of see how things have changed. And yeah, you know, each book, it's with the Lions of Fifth Avenue, I heard about this book theft in the 1990s, so that made sense to set it there, because I couldn't have it too far advanced where technology would get in the way of the book theft, if that makes sense. I'm being kind of cryptic.
Mm.
And then I like the 1910s because that's, again, near to when it first opened. So when it was kind of fresh and new in New York.
Okay. Gail has also said that the Whitney Museum and the Brooklyn Museum would be other great buildings to consider.
Yeah, the Brooklyn is just a grand building. I love that idea. That's a really good one.
And Anissa said, did the Lions have any other titles, or was that the only title that you had?
Yeah, that was to call it the Lions of Fifth Avenue. That was my editor and my agent came up with that. Okay. I'm terrible with titles normally, so they came up with that. And it makes sense because there's these two great lions out front. They're named Patience and Fortitude, and they were named by one of the mayors after Depression era values. And so they're very beloved. In fact, during the last year during quarantine, they were wearing 2-foot wide masks over their faces. And so that makes sense because they're kind of an iconic part of the library that people recognize. And then when they came up with that title, I changed the family's name in the book to Lyons, Lyons. So that the title refers to both the building and what's going on inside. And I try to do that with each one.
Yeah, okay. I'm wondering about the characters in your book. So obviously there's a lot of characters who are original people's names that were in that building in that era. But do you have a lot of characters that you make up their names as well?
Yeah, most of them are made up. Most of them are completely made up. They may be inspired. Like there's a character, Clara, in The Masterpiece, who is the illustrator who works at the school in the 1920s. And she's based on an actual illustrator named Helen Dryden, who was, she came to New York. She did 90 covers for Vogue magazine. She did sets and costumes for Broadway. She was the first female faculty member at the Grand Central School of Art. She became, the highest paid female artist in America in the 30s, and then she disappeared. And so I take something like that and then create a character around that. And again, explain it in the book so that the actual Helen Dryden gets her due as you're reading more about it. And that's a lot of fun to kind of bring that to life. So yeah, the Frick book is one where there's some people who are real, but in general, most of the people are completely made up.
Yeah, okay. And you obviously do a lot of research for your books. Could you tell us how long on average it takes you to write a book?
Yeah, it's about a year and a half these days. I've slowed down a little bit just because there's a lot of more press and Zoom talks and things that are a lot of fun to do. So yeah, it usually takes about 3 or 4 months of research where I'm really getting out there. I'm getting in the building. I'm trying to interview people who work in the building or did work or live there. I talk to architectural historians to find out the history. And then it's just following these breadcrumbs to where a plot and characters start to bubble up. And then I spend about 3 or 4 months writing the first draft, and then I do about 10 revisions to that before it's ready to go to my editor. So it's a long process, and there's a lot of revising.
Yeah. And could you... I've got a question from Alan. She said, are any of your characters in more than one book?
Oh, not yet, but that would be fun, wouldn't it, to have a little crossover? I love that idea. That's a very good idea. Yeah, and it's so interesting what's going on these days with for example, there's 2 books out that are wonderful. The Rose Code by Kate Quinn.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And so good. And Marie Benedict's The Mystery of Mrs. Christie.
Okay.
And those 2 authors, so that one's about Agatha Christie and the other one's about Bletchley Park in London. And there's an Agatha Christie kind of crossover in both books. And so the 2 authors got together and created a short story that's now on Audible. Okay. It's called Smoke Signals. That kind of melds those 2 stories together without giving anything away.
Yeah, that's really interesting,
Yeah, so there's a lot you can do. And I love the idea of a character hopping across the books. I think that's a great idea. I'll have to figure that out.
Yeah, it is a good idea. Could you tell us what you like reading yourself, and maybe if there's anything you've been reading lately that you'd like to recommend to us?
Sure. I love historical fiction, of course, and I also love thrillers and mysteries. That's kind of what I go to. And then lately, there's a wonderful book that just came out in the U.S. called "Who Is Maud Dixon," and it's by a woman named Alexandra Andrews, and it's her debut, and it's a great, great book. It's a great kind of twisty. It's not a thriller, but it's just a twisty mystery that's really compelling with characters that you're kind of blown away by, and then settings like Morocco that are really exotic, which is kind of fun.
Especially
so that was a good one.
Time when
and then
travel there.
Yeah, Who Is Maud Dixon? Oh, it's great. And then the other book that I really loved this year so far is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. And that's by a woman named V.E. Schwab. And that's kind of magical historical fiction is the way I describe it. And about a woman who's cursed and she'll never die, but no one will ever remember who she is. It's just a wonderful premise, and she does it really, really well.
Thanks for those recommendations. They're ones that I haven't heard of before, so we'll need to look them up.
You'll love them, I promise.
Yeah, thanks. And what do you think about book reviews? Do you like reading them, or you try to steer clear?
You know what's so funny is just today I was on Twitter, and if you follow A Mighty Blaze, which is a kind of a book group started by
I've seen that.
They're wonderful. It started by two authors right before quarantine hit to kind of support other authors publishing their books, and it's just taken on a storm. And so they started publishing things where they have authors like Chris Bojalian, like Christina Baker Klein, reading their negative reviews from Amazon or Goodreads. And it's so funny. And so I highly recommend going on Twitter and checking out A Mighty Blaze.
I've seen a few other authors do that.
Yeah, Chris Bojalian does one just recently that was
funny. Yeah.
And so, but for me, I read reviews from newspapers or kind of trade magazines because it's interesting. You never know. Luckily, most of them are good, so that's nice. And then, it's wonderful with Amazon that you can kind of get a sense of a book by the reviews, but there's so many that, you could kind of get lost in them if you looked at them too closely. But I think there's such a major force for deciding whether or not you're going to buy a book. To go to something and see it's 4.3 stars and be like, yeah, okay, that sounds good because there's 2,000 reviews. And so I think it's really helpful for people to figure out what they might like and might not like.
Divine's wondering if we'll see any of your novels come to TV.
That would be great. There's been some interest, and we'll see what happens. It's, I'm told that the dual timeline historical fiction is very expensive.
Yeah, will be
to do because especially if I have one that's in the 1970s and the 1920s, you're asking for a lot of props and set design. But we'll see. I think there's such an appetite for books onto screen these days, and there's so many wonderful things happening. And I think there's more and more historical fiction that's being snapped up. So fingers crossed. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, hopefully one day we'll see.
Yeah.
And are you a writer who has a long list of ideas for future books, or do you just try and concentrate on what you're doing now and not worry about what's in the future?
I cannot multitask. I'm not good at it. So I do tend to, it's like you put on, blinders and try and keep my head down as I'm writing one book, because if not, there's always something to tempt me and a kind of an internet rabbit hole to go down if I start considering other buildings. So right now the book about the Frick is with my editor, and so that's kind of moving into the production pipeline. And so I'm starting to kind of play around with a new idea, and we'll see where it leads me.
Gail's wondering what gave you the inspiration to write about Chelsea Girls.
Oh, yeah. So The Chelsea Girls is the book that's set at the Chelsea Hotel. And it's from the point of view of two best friends, both women, a playwright and an actress. And they're trying to put a play on Broadway during the McCarthy era, which was a very fraught time in U.S. political history. And the idea for that came from actually meeting an actress who was 98 years old at the time. and we were talking about her past, and she talked about what it was like being blacklisted as an actress in New York City in the 1950s, and just how maddening it was, and how nothing was in your control, and it was almost like the powers that be just decided that all these people were bad and cut them off from their livelihoods, and people committed suicide, they went bankrupt. It was just a terrible, terrible time in American history. And the way she talked about it, she got so angry. Like, she was just as mad talking about it as she'd been 50 years earlier. And it made me realize, wow, there's a lot I don't know about this time period, and made me want to create a character that was inspired by her.
Oh, well, no, that's really interesting.
She said they have dinner at 6.
Tell us what for you
and to come earlier than that. So I thought I might leave.
Yeah, you know, for me, a good story are characters who are complex, who, you know, they're not all good or all bad. They're kind of a mix. And a story that I can't predict what's going to happen, and that I'm delightfully surprised at what happens. And also a story that's just, you know, written in a way that you feel like you're in good hands. It's a confident writer. So you know you kind of are floating on a boat and it's not going to sink. That's kind of vague, isn't it? But yeah.
No, it makes sense though. Yeah. Patricia's wondering if you have any advice for a budding historical fiction writer.
Yeah, sure. You know, I would say read a ton of historical fiction. See if you can find, there's a lot of online workshops where you can start kind of playing around with short stories or something like that to get a sense of you know, how to put a story together. And then there's wonderful things like the Historical Novel Society, which is, you know, for all historical fiction writers. And they do, their conference is going to be all virtual this year. I think it's in June. And you can go there virtually and take classes in craft or hear panels of historical fiction writers who you adore, find out how they do it. And so it's really digging in, and there's so many opportunities now because of Zoom to hear other authors talk about their process and kind of figure out what bits and pieces work for you, because not everything will, and you have to kind of forge your own way. There's some people who, you know, sit down and just see where the story goes, and other people who plot out very carefully. And you just have to kind of figure out which one you are and what works best for you. But it's so much fun. And I have to say the community of historical fiction authors is fantastic. I have so many friends who I met only, you know, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago who are now really close friends because we're all authors and we're all based around New York. And suddenly there's this great community of women who understand what you're doing and how you're doing it. And you can kind of vent or, you know, share in each other's successes. It's really kind of a joy in your 50s to suddenly have all these new friends. It's wonderful.
Yeah, that's great. And do your friends that you have met through there, do you share what you've been writing to like sort of sound off with each other and check how they think your writing's going?
Not necessarily. We'll talk in general terms, but we don't tend to read each other's work until it's kind of up and published. Although I think everybody has like a couple readers that beta readers who kind of go through their you know, their drafts. But when we're getting together, it's more kind of general terms of, oh, I'm having a problem with this plot or this character, and just being able to kind of talk about it. And also the business of it, of, oh, this agent, what do you think of her? You know, what do you think of that editor? It's just a wonderful kind of neighborhood to get your questions answered and share your resources.
Yeah. I'm also wondering, when you first started writing, did you have an author who really inspired you with your historical writing?
Yeah, you know, there's a book called The Perfume Collector by Kathleen Tesaro. And that was a book that I just adored. And that was the one that I really studied to figure out how one creates a dual timeline work. And there's also authors like Eve Chase, who's a British author who again writes great dual timeline. And then of course like Kate Quinn. There's a number who I just love, and we're just really inspiring to read their work and think, wow, maybe one day.
And just reminding people before we finish off, if you've got any more questions, please type them in comments. While we wait to see if there are any more questions, could you tell people how they can keep in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm on, my website is FionaDavisBooks.com, and there you can sign up for my newsletter and get the news on kind of the latest book and what's coming out and what's going on when. And then I'm Fiona Davis Author on Instagram and on, I'm a Fiona Davis Author and Fiona Davis Books. And Fiona Davis Books is Twitter and my website. And then Facebook and Instagram is Fiona Davis Author. Okay. So search for those, you'll find me.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'll be signing up to your newsletter and looking to have a look at all the photos behind the books. I need to, I'm really excited.
Yeah. Facebook's a great spot to do that. That's where, if there is research, that's where I tend to put it up. It's a good forum for that.
Okay. So thanks so much for joining us today. I've really loved chatting to you. Been very interesting. And thanks everyone for your questions. We've had some great questions. And so bye everyone.
Thank you so much for this, Jackie. This was such a wonderful opportunity. And thank you to everybody for tuning in. I had an absolute blast. Great questions.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.